So Oregon's season ends in an embarrassment, but was it a failure?
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. This episode brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Lots to get to today. Some guys we know are coming back. The impact of someone like Jahlil Florence or Blake Purchase returning to the Ducks. And what should Oregon fans watch for now that they're done in the playoffs? Should they watch the playoff at all? I mean, I'm going to, of course, all coming up on today's show. But I want to start with this particular question. In the wake of Oregon's loss to Ohio State in the Rose Bowl, a lot of Oregon fans understandably frustrated. To suggest, though, that the season was not still a success at some level, to me is incredibly incorrect for a couple of reasons. First of all, are we going to just ignore the fact that Oregon went 13-0, including a Big Ten championship? That's a failure. That's a failure. I said coming into this year that the baseline expectation for success was 10-2 and making the college football playoff. Because in the 12-team era, 10-2 will get you there. Ohio State showed that. They had a close loss, of course, to Oregon. Going to keep reminding people of that fact if Ohio State wins the national championship because it feels relevant to certain discussions that I've had with individuals. But Ohio State then loses to Michigan in shocking fashion, and they're still in. So Oregon probably could have gone 10-2 and gotten into the playoff, which is what I thought before the year. So that was my baseline standard of that's a successful season. So not making the playoff is what a failure of a season would look like. With the roster that Oregon had, getting blown out in a playoff game, which is far more common than people really realize. And by the way, this happens in the NFL as well. The Chiefs one year, who are going to be the number one seed again in the AFC, but they'll have to deal with the likes perhaps at some point of Justin Herbert and Bo Nix because those two guys are going to the playoff, which is fantastic. Mariota is too, as a backup for the Commanders to Jaden Daniels. So the Chiefs once upon a time got to the Super Bowl and they played the Buccaneers and their offensive line was all banged up. Oregon's was not. And the Chiefs got blown out. Is that a failure of a season? No, there's a difference between a failure of a season and not hitting your ceiling. Oregon didn't hit its ceiling because I have argued and will continue to argue that its ceiling was winning the national championship. They did not achieve that. Okay, so they didn't hit their ceiling. That's not a failure of a season. A failure would have been going 9-3 where you lose to Ohio State, you lose to Michigan, and maybe you'd lost to Washington again, or you'd lost that game to Wisconsin. If you'd then gone 9-3 and missed the playoff, that's a failure. Because the expectation based on the way the roster had been put together and the fact that the coaching staff, most of them, not all, Stein's in his second year, but most of them are just wrapped up their third season in Eugene. That's where the standard for success was. So I understand the emotional frustration with how the year ended. I get it. I felt it. I was watching in silent despair on my couch, just like many of you were, as Oregon was not able to contain Jeremiah Smith in the Ohio State offense, nor were they able to get any sort of push up front in the ground game, made them one-dimensional, and all the problems that ensued in the Rose Bowl game. I'm not telling you to be chipper about how it ended, but the last impression you have of this season is not emblematic of how the season actually was or what the season actually was. Because to look at a 13-win season, which has happened one other time in Oregon football history. I know formats have changed and the expanded playoff and a longer season, all that sort of stuff. I get it. I get that's different. There's been one other season in which Oregon won 13 games in a year. I'm not considering that a failure. By just a straight wins component, you had the second best season in the history of Oregon football. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Won a conference championship, by the way. You cannot look at that season and say, it was a failure. It wasn't where it was all just, it has an incredibly disappointing ending to what was a great year. And right now, here in early January, I think a lot of us are allowing the emotional teardown that was the Rose Bowl to just wash out what was a great season and a great team and a fun one to watch. You've forgotten how fun it was if you were at Autzen Stadium to shout going into the fourth quarter against the Buckeyes or up big against Washington. You forgot about all of that because your last memory, your last impression is what your only impression. And I just encourage you to not let that be the case. I was randomly scrolling through my phone the other day. I was looking for a video of something, and I came across the reaction video that I tweeted out after Oregon beat Ohio State on October 12th. I was in the suit coming out of a Southern Utah broadcast, go Birds, and I was, running across the street trying to get to my car as quickly as I could. Like, that literally made me feel good for a moment because it reminded me this was a fun season. This was great. It had a disappointing ending. But to look at Oregon and say it's a failure, I understand that winning the Big Ten championship doesn't feel like winning the Pac-12 championship or Pac-10 championship to go to the Rose Bowl back in 2009, beating Oregon State in the Civil War. I get that it doesn't feel the same because Oregon's done that before. And we're all sitting here waiting for the one season Oregon does something that they haven't done before. They'd been to the playoff previously. They hadn't been in a decade, by the way. Just keep that in mind. But they'd been to the playoff before. They've won a playoff game before. They've won a conference championship. We're always looking for what's next. And I get the frustration there. I really, really do. But when you look across the landscape of college football, there are teams that had a failure of a season. Alabama failed this year. Not making the playoff, not being able to go 10-2, losing to Vanderbilt and Oklahoma. That's what failing looks and feels like. And then they went out and lost the ReliaQuest Bowl to Michigan. But their failure of a season was finalized by just being in that game and all they needed was 10-2, and they couldn't get there. And every single season, that's going to be where I come at, unless Oregon's recruiting significantly drops off. That's where my standard for success is. Are you able to go 10-2? I mean, Oregon's schedule next year is incredibly favorable. Oklahoma State is coming to Autzen. Oregon's not going to Stillwater. Oregon State is coming to Autzen. The byes are more evenly spread out, shall we say, so that Oregon doesn't play 8 straight games. No Ohio State, no Michigan. You got to go at Penn State. Oregon just beat Penn State. Don't tell me they can't do it. I don't know that they will, because Penn State, as we know, is really good, but Oregon was better than them this year, and Penn State's going to reload in the offseason. Drew Allar's coming back. Oregon's reloading at a number of different position groups this offseason, as many of us know. So the way that Oregon's season ended should not define the season as a whole. I get that it's, for a lot of you, a zero-sum game, because I, like many of you, we've been waiting decades at this point for Oregon to have that national championship season. I do believe Dan Lanning will get Oregon there, and it stinks that it didn't happen this year. But I bet you have a better recollection of the 2024 Oregon football season in February or March or April than you did the month prior. That's just my guess. At that time, you can let me know if I'm wrong. But Alabama missing the playoff, that's a failure. Auburn missing a bowl game, that was a failure of a season. Oklahoma going under 500 its first year in the SEC. That's what bottom out. Florida State, preseason top 10 and ending the year 2-10. That's what a failure of a season looks like. Oregon had a great year in which they won the Big Ten. They were rewarded by playing maybe the best roster in the entire country. I know Lanning won't make excuses for that. It's completely fair for your first thought. Your first thought should be Oregon needs to be better. Your second thought should be Oregon shouldn't have to be in that position. It is completely fair and reasonable to have those thoughts. But at the end of the day, you're probably going to have to beat Ohio State eventually, even if the format had been as, it should be in the college football playoff. So maybe they just weren't going to get there on a neutral site. Maybe they weren't. We'll never know, of course. But there are a lot of other college football teams that had as lofty of expectations as Oregon or in the similar range that didn't even come close to getting there. Those teams are ones you look at and say, that was a failure of a season. Oregon, no, a disappointing end to a great year. Let me know your thoughts, though. If you disagree, drop them in the YouTube comments below. I'm sure everybody will agree. There's nothing but widespread agreement and reason takes down in the good old YouTube comments section. But I invite it anyway, or hit me up on Twitter, by all means. So at least a couple guys we know are coming back to the Ducks. And you should know why that matters. Are we going to get another one? Or first, are we going to talk about game time? Yeah, we're talking about game time first. Then we'll get to Bryce Betcher and the rest of the Ducks that are or maybe not returning and all that good stuff. But attending the new 12-team college football playoff is an experience that brings fans together like never before. If you want to go to any of the games that are left, or if you want to go to games in the future, or if you want to go to any sort of event, Game Time is the place to go. Game Time has Game Time picks that makes getting tickets for events even easier. It filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. I've used Game Time before. It is easy. They have a bunch of great features. Their prices are reasonable. They've got everything you want in a ticketing app. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE. That's Locked On College for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Second segment sips are essential. So is having talented players on your roster. See what I did there? Yeah. All right. Bryce Betcher could return. We don't know. We don't know, as I record this show, whether or not Betcher will return. I'd be super down for it because without Betcher being in Oregon's linebacker room, I look at that position group and say a transfer would make a lot of sense because you're losing Jeffrey Bassa and you're losing Justin Jacobs. That's a lot of experience. So the only experienced guy would then be Devin Jackson. And maybe they feel great about guys like Kamar Mathuti or Braden Platt or Dylan Williams. Maybe they feel like those guys, Jerry Mixon, who have been a part of the last couple of recruiting cycles, maybe they feel like they're ready to take that jump forward. That's asking a lot, especially when you look at what this position group has been for the Ducks over the last couple of years. Think about a guy like Devin Jackson, for instance. Really talented player coming out of high school, redshirted in the 22 season, stayed with the Ducks, I made a 21-22 jump in there. Thought there was a Cristobal Lanning component and then realized that was incorrect and corrected myself in real time. How about that? So I'm like way too impressed with myself for doing that. But I think about these things too often. Okay, anyway, I'm getting sidetracked here. So Jackson in 2022, redshirts. 23 season, he plays a little. In 2024, he plays more. In 2025, he could be Oregon's top linebacker. That's the evidence we have so far in terms of career progression at the linebacker position for Dan Lanning, Tosh Lupoy, and the rest of the defensive coaches. So maybe they feel that a guy like Jerry Mixon, who was a part of that 23 class, maybe he's ready to make the jump. Or maybe they're good putting redshirt freshmen out there. I'd be surprised. So this all came about after it was revealed that Tosh Lupoy and company are looking into the possibility of getting Bryce Betcher another year of eligibility. And I would be open to this for two reasons. The first one I mentioned, that there isn't really a veteran presence in that room. Betcher was also Oregon's best linebacker this year. The second reason, though, here comes the baseball fan in me. Maybe he wouldn't wind up going to the Astros organization. Oh, that'd be great. That'd be great. So he was drafted in the 13th round to the Houston Astros this year. And I mean, guys wait all the time before they, begin their major league careers. And if Bryce, who walked on senior day, wants to come back for another season, hey, I'd be here for it. Now, his eligibility question for the NCAA is different than what might be asked for Kobe Savage or Jamari Caldwell, whose eligibility is centered around the Diego Pavia rule that is giving players that would have run out of eligibility after this season, which just came to a close, of course, for everyone except for the 4 teams left in the playoff, because of prior JUCO years, because that was played under the NJCAA, the argument by Diego Pavia was, hey, you're depriving me of financial opportunities here because of look what I just did. I beat Alabama and Auburn in the same season. I beat Auburn again. I could make NIL money, but you're depriving me of that because I played for a different organization. They said, okay, we'll give you a year. And to my knowledge, there has not been a long-term resolution on that, but there is a 1-year resolution, which is if you are going to be out of eligibility because of past JUCO years, you can have 1 more year in the 25-26 campaign. So Betchers is different than that, but I think that would be, if he came back, frankly, I'd be fine with Oregon's linebacker room at that point. Maybe they'd bring in a transfer, but you'd have a lot of options there. I can't imagine none of those guys are ready to have a role. And if you have 2 veterans at the top of that depth chart, it seems, in terms of guys who have, veteran experience, like Mixon will be going into his 3rd year, but hasn't played, consistently meaningful snaps for the Ducks. I'd imagine at least one of those guys is ready to be a rotational player going into their 2nd or 3rd season of college football. So that's the first name to think about here. Second one is Jahlil Florence, who said he's absolutely coming back. He got injured last year and wasn't able to get fully healthy and didn't play this season. I can see him being one of Oregon's 2 starting corners going into next year. Because when he has played and been healthy for the Ducks in his career, he's been a starter. In 23, he and Kyrie Jackson were just rolling through all the secondary guys. He and Kyrie Jackson were the 2 starting corners. Now, coming off of an injury, that's a question. I think it's a fair one to ask. Is he the same guy? But if he is, I've always been a huge Jahlil Florence fan. He's one of the guys who has played since he was a true freshman for Dan Lanning and the staff. He was a rotational guy back in that 22 secondary headline by Christian Gonzalez, who's also absolutely crushing it for the Patriots, who are now going into a new head coach. I have no idea what the Patriots are doing, but Gonzo's a stud regardless. So Florence is somebody who just took an entire year off of football, and we'll see what he would be, but if he's fully healthy, ready to go, I darkly pencil him into what I mean, not lightly pencil, but like heavily pencil. Is that the right word? I don't know. That's a term I've never used before. So you can heavily pencil him in, maybe not Sharpie, but you can write him in as that's probably a starting outside corner. And maybe Theron Johnson, the Northwestern transfer, is a guy that started another spot, but there are a lot of secondary options. Secondary and receiver, a lot of turnover from this season going into 2025 for the Ducks. So more than a little fascinated to see how all of those things play out. But that's not the only returner that has been confirmed. Blake Purchase is coming back. So before the Rose Bowl, there was an interesting piece about Purchase, who redshirted this season after playing a significant role in the 23 campaign. I can't remember off the top of my head a guy who has done this, where you play and then redshirt and then go back to playing. He said in the piece, I think it was from James Crepey of the Oregonian, that, it was just what they felt was best for his development. All right, I trust the staff with a defensive line. They just put together the best defensive line that Oregon has had in a decade. And it should be really good again next year. You've brought in Bear Alexander. Mateo is back. He's a future first-round pick that next year will be his last of college football. Tatum Tuioti has been rock solid for the last couple of seasons. If you were to toss Blake Purchase back into the mix, I don't know what exactly led them to, see that he was a great candidate to redshirt this season and to not play this year as much as he could have, but there was clearly something. Maybe he was dealing with an injury. Maybe he needed to get his body more into game shape. I don't know. But he and Tuioti and Mateo all were impact true freshmen in 2023. And then Tatum and Mateo both took steps forward this year, and Purchase just kind of wasn't around. But guy was super talented coming out of high school. So if he's ready to go and you put him on the defensive line, all right, great. it's just a curious situation. I can't recall. You guys can let me know in the comments below, or shoot me a note on Twitter, but I can't think of a guy who, assuming health, which, Lanning and health reports, he's not always giving out all the information. So maybe he was dinged up and that's where they got to, a Matthew Bedford situation where he was hurt, but then by the time he got back, was he fully 100%? And the expectation is that Matthew Bedford will be back next year along the offensive line. Maybe it's a situation like that. That would make more sense. But if they did it just based on play style, I can't remember seeing that before from a player that, I've covered here on the show or that I can even remember watching or reading about as a kid. So Betcher, question marks. But Florence and Purchase, both coming back for Oregon's defense, I think are both nice pieces. And Florence is more likely of the two to be a starting player right away. But Blake Purchase is not shy on talent. We saw that in his true freshman year. So I'm always in favor, as is always the case, any position group, anytime. If you're able to keep more talent in the room, this is a guy who I got questions about throughout the season. Multiple times people said, hey, do you think this guy's going to transfer? I said, kind of looks that way. He's just falling down the depth chart. Well, turns out we don't always know everything from afar. And I'm here for a guy of Purchase's talent and potential being there along the defensive line for the Ducks. So if you got thoughts, by all means, YouTube comments or Twitter, hit me up. Let's discuss the playoff as well. Many things with the playoff. Should Oregon root for Ohio State? That's a complicated question. But before we get to that question, we're getting to FanDuel. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed. Guaranteed. You don't even have to be right. Win or lose, the FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same-game parlays, and so much more. If you want to spice up the remaining college football playoff games, I know it's frustrating Oregon is not a part of it anymore, but guess what? It's still college football, and once it's gone, we're all going to be sad. The season's gone by in the blink of an eye, so make it more exciting with FanDuel. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. Get started with $200 in bonus bets at FanDuel.com. FanDuel.com, that's the place to go. FanDuel.com, make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So, a couple mailbag questions here came in from Bud, who's a Locked On Ducks insider, which you can become as well. Link in the description below, free 14-day trial. You get priority access and a bunch of other perks, not just sending me mailbag questions, but we can chat, go back and forth. And it's a lot of fun. So Bud says, as I reflect on this past Oregon football season and the disastrous Rose Bowl, I'm reminded of the Golden State Warriors a few years ago when they set the regular season record for wins and then failed miserably in the playoffs. Seems like there might be valuable losses during the regular season. Your thought? There seems like there might be value in a loss during the regular season. Your thoughts? There only would have been value in a loss in the Big Ten championship game. So I have flipped my opinion on this because I got new information and it became pretty clear watching the quarterfinal playoff games go. I had a show where I came on here before the Penn State game and said, yes, Oregon wants to win, thinking you want to be as rested as possible. But the rust factor was clearly at play. Now, it's only 1 year. So maybe I'll flip-flop again next year when the playoff rolls around. But it doesn't seem like a coincidence to me. I know Arizona State got that game into overtime and should have won against Texas, which is why I come back to, ultimately Oregon needed to be better, not have a better playoff format, though we should still get a better playoff format in this wonderful and beautiful sport. But it is not a coincidence to me that all four of the teams that had a 3-week layoff were all bad in the first quarter. Georgia couldn't move the ball in the first quarter. They didn't do it a lot during the game. But Arizona State eventually got things going, but they were down 14-3 in the blink of an eye. Boise State made the game competitive. They were down 2 possessions quickly. But then they stabilized and proved they could be on the field with that team, and Oregon just never got to that point. I don't think that's a coincidence, but there would have been a value in that loss. Clearly. Because I watched Oregon play Penn State, and they were better. And Penn State went and won those games. I feel good. Now, hypotheticals are just that. They're only hypotheticals. I feel confident Oregon would be in the playoff semifinals if they had lost the Big Ten championship game. Doesn't mean they would have won the national championship. It does mean the season would still be going. Because no one was able to come into Autzen Stadium and win. I don't think someone like SMU was going to do that. And then you play Boise State, and look, Boise State gave Penn State more trouble than a 17-point final score would indicate. And we watched Boise State give Oregon fits earlier this season at Autzen Stadium. Beating a team twice is hard. I do think Oregon was playing much better football at the end of the year than they were early in the year. So, yeah, I would have felt good about Oregon's chances in that particular spot. But we can sit here from the outside and say, oh, it would have made sense. Oh, they should have done this. That is never, ever in a million years the message a coach wants to send to a locker room. We don't want to win this game. It's okay, we lost. Once you do that, you lose an edge. You lose an edge, and look, maybe Oregon lost that edge anyway because they had such a long layoff and they weren't able to get it together. Maybe. But you go out and try and win the football games. Full stop, period, point blank, end of discussion, and don't try to... I don't like the message that sends for the locker room. The solution is get a better playoff where we have things that make sense, where everyone can look and say, this doesn't make sense, it was wrong. You got guys like Joel Klatt going out there and stumping for the fact that Oregon got screwed. They certainly did. They still should have played better. Not that, like, point number one. I want to make this very clear because people get all hot and bothered with this conversation. Point number one, Oregon needs to get better in a couple areas and needed to be better in that particular game. That is the first thing that should be on Oregon fans' minds when they think about the Rose Bowl. Point number two, should not have been playing Ohio State in that spot. Pretty clearly. So that leads me to this question that came from Gavin. Then we'll get back to another one from Bud. Hey, Spencer, can we talk about how bad the 12-team playoff actually is? Welcome to the dark side, my friend. Welcome. I've won you over. From the formatting to the actual games, it has been a complete and utter failure. Did you watch Texas and Arizona State, though? That game was awesome. And I'm not saying that because I am a duck. It was clear as day those 3 weeks off affected all 4 of those teams. And with all 4 of the top 4 teams losing convincingly shows how badly the College Football Committee screwed this up. Yep. All right, on to the next point. I'm just not surprised that there are these clear and obvious mistakes. You expanded the playoff and gave more power to people who had screwed up a bunch of things in the sport in the first place. Why are you surprised they screwed it up? I'm agreeing with you, by the way. I'm with you, Gavin. I hear you. I'm just saying, yeah, they screwed it up. I hope they fix it. I'm not optimistic that they will. There was a report from Brett McMurphy that, conversations about fixing the auto buys for 2025 were going to happen. And then Heather Dinich of ESPN came out a few days ago and said, yeah, that's probably not going to take place. So you're going to be left with the same scenario next year where you'll go into conference championship weekend thinking, do we really want to win this game? Because in hindsight, no, Oregon did not want to win the Big Ten championship. But you're not going to tell that to your team. So, all right, last one here. This from Bud. My initial reaction is to root for the Buckeyes to decisively win their next 2 games to reflect positively on Oregon and the Big Ten. Your thoughts? Who would you like to see in the championship game? Ohio State versus Penn State, both of whom Oregon beat this year. Yeah, I don't think this is a high impact situation per se. But if Oregon has a win over the national champions, I at the very least would hope that reminds people that this team was indeed capable of winning it all. Because there's plenty of pushback out there about Oregon was fraudulent. Oregon was never actually good enough. Oregon's so far away from when I'm going, no, they had a couple of weaknesses that Ohio State was able to exploit, particularly at the safety position. But if you get Ohio State, Penn State, that's what I'd be rooting for in the national championship game. That would reaffirm my confidence that Dan Lanning is capable of playing at a championship level. Because I saw him play both those teams on a football field, not on paper, and beat them. I watched Ohio State kick their rear end in as well. But if it's those 2 teams, reflects better on the Big Ten, those are our brethren now. I don't feel some vitriolic disdain for Ohio State. I really don't. Most of the fans I've interacted with via the online space, they've been, hey, you guys are great. Ohio State was just better today. Best of luck. Go Bucks. Like that's what it's mostly been. It's not all of them. But mostly I kind of like Ohio State fans, at least the ones that have found my channel. So yeah, I think that Ohio State winning would back up what I've said for the last couple of weeks, which is Oregon's good enough to win it all. They just didn't happen to be good enough on that particular day, which somehow was only less than a week ago. Feels like it's been a long time, and yet it hasn't. So yeah, I'll pull for an all Big Ten national championship game. And I'm not saying that Oregon should, hang a UCF banner of beat the teams in the national championship game. No, not saying that. I don't think it's hugely impactful one way or the other. But rooting for the Buckeyes, yeah. I don't think it matters a ton one way or the other because as we've seen, teams can have good days. Teams can have not as good days. But yeah, go Big Ten, I guess. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day and go Ducks.